everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to introduce our first panel. As Professor Darroch just mentioned, it is titled Deep Histories of Culture and Identity in the Mediterranean and East Asia. Our first presenter this morning is my advisee, Zayd Mohammed. He is a senior majoring in information technology and informatics, minoring in history and philosophy. Zayd enjoys training in martial arts, specifically grappling, which is more commonly known as jiu-jitsu. And he also loves to hike in the mountains. And he says he's nervous about presenting today, and he is therefore questioning his decision-making up to this point. This morning, Zayd will speak to us about his fantastic senior thesis, which is titled The Moriscos of Spain, A Story of Clandestine Piety. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. So today I want to tell you a story about a group of people known as the Moriscos, who inhabited Spain in the 16th and early 17th centuries. And in order to do that, it's important to get into some brief historical background about who they were and how they came to be. So from the year 711 until 1492, a span of nearly 800 years, an Islamic political presence existed in some capacity within the country of Spain, meaning that there existed some Islamic authority within Spain that ruled over some portion of the country. Throughout this period, there of course existed a sizable population of Muslims within Spain, which at one point constituted the majority population of the country. And in the year 1492, the last political stronghold of Islam in Spain, which was the city of Granada, was conquered by northern Christian kingdoms. This was an incredibly important moment in the history of Spanish Islam because it marked the official end of Muslim political power in Spain after nearly 8 centuries. So following the conquest, the monarchs guaranteed the local Muslim population of Granada the right to freely practice their religion, in addition to other guarantees contained within the surrender agreement. Eventually, the monarchs decided to void the terms of the original agreement and determined that the Muslims of Granada be obligated to convert to Christianity upon the pain of expulsion from their homes. This same policy would eventually become applicable to the whole of Spain, and every Muslim resident of Spain would have to either convert to Christianity or leave the country. So it is these forcibly converted Muslims and their descendants who became known as Moriscos.
Zayd pointed at the, pointed, see if that works. Or not.
Doesn't seem to be working.
Oh.
Right, so this is, you can see here, this is a panel in the Royal Chapel of Granada depicting the conversion of Granadan Muslims in 1501. So from this point onwards, any expression of Islam or its practice could not legally exist within Spain. And in the 1530s, the institution of the Spanish Inquisition began to persecute Moriscos as apostates. Right, so it is in this context of religious persecution, Moriscos who remained in Spain, or at least those of them that value their faith, had a difficult choice to make. Would they give in to the pressure to religiously conform and renounce the true, divinely inspired religion upon which their salvation rested, or would they attempt to continue the practice of Islam in secret, away from the prying eyes of inquisitorial authorities? And it should be noted that Moriscos were not monolithic in terms of how they responded to this central question, as there were some who assimilated religiously, while there were others who remained steadfast Muslims and continued the practice of Islam in secret. And my interest was in this latter Morisco group of secret Muslims, or crypto-Muslims as they're referred to. And the primary questions I was interested in had to do with how these Moriscos, who were forcibly converted to Christianity in the early 16th century, at least officially, and were subjected to intense religious persecution throughout the century, how were they able to preserve their faith and religious identity throughout this time? Moreover, in what condition did Islamic traditions survive amongst them? and what was the state of their Islam and their Islamic practice. Right, so in getting into these questions, it'd be useful to first get a grasp of the religious or jurisprudential underpinnings of Morisco Islam, or its justification. You might ask why there would be a need for Moriscos to justify or religiously legitimize their crypto-Islamic practice. Well, following the forced conversion of Spain's Muslims, many Islamic scholars determined that the Moriscos were religiously obligated to emigrate from Spain, as the public practice of religion was considered essential to being a beautiful Muslim. Many such Muslims vehemently counseled the Moriscos to leave Spain and advised that for the sake of their salvation, they should even embrace martyrdom if immigration wasn't an option. In other words, it's a very serious matter from a religious perspective and would have been a cause for concern for the Moriscos who took their religion seriously. It was in this context that a North African Islamic scholar by the name of Al-Wahrani, also known as the Mufti of Oran, wrote his famous Oran fatwa to the Moriscos of Spain. In this fatwa, or Islamic legal ruling, Al-Wahrani granted the Moriscos permission to outwardly appear as devoted Catholics, while internally maintaining and dissimulating their genuine Islamic religiosity. The Mufti even provided detailed instructions on how they could continue to observe their Islamic practices, adapting them to the harsh realities of religious persecution. The following is an extract from the fatwa, which I'll read to you, and part of which you can see on the slide. To all of you brothers that hold our law in your hands, in the same manner a person grabs a burning coal in his hands, you are part of the number of those for whom God has multiplied the rewards in the afterlife. That is why you suffer and work in the present life. In saying this, the Mufti recognized the difficulty which faced Moriscos as they struggled to observe the regular Islamic obligations in the aftermath of the forced conversions. In light of this difficulty, he even offers practical guides for fulfilling the central Islamic obligations covertly so as to avoid suspicion and persecution. For example, the Mufti provided the Moriscos practical instructions on how they could secretly perform the wudu, which is an act of ritual purification required for the validity of the daily compulsory prayers. He writes, in this regard, in cases where it is impossible to follow the precepts of the law, it is permitted to do it, meaning the ritual purification, under the appearance that you are taking a bath in the sea or river. And in situations where this cannot be done, and where the water needed to follow these precepts is lacking, then you can put some water in the ground or in clean sand and cleanse yourself with this. With this, you are fulfilling your obligation. As you might be able to tell, the significance of the Mufti's fatwa for the Moriscos was twofold. One, it permitted them to secretly practice Islam, something which had been problematized by many Islamic scholars, and two, it provided them with practical guides on how they could observe the regular Islamic obligations in secret and adapted ways. Thus, with the support of the Quran fatwa, the Moriscos had themselves a religiously legitimate foundation and useful practical guidelines upon which they could then conduct their crypto-Islamic activity in the Morisco period. And it's also interesting to note that copies of this fatwa were possessed by Moriscos generations after it was initially written by this scholar, which is a testament to its important role in guiding their covert religious lives. Right, so moving on, we know that a portion of Moriscos secretly remain Muslims, but under such circumstances of religious persecution, the question of in what state did their Islam survive becomes relevant. Again, from the 1530s on, Moriscos were subjected to persecution by the Inquisition as apostates, if of course they were suspected of engaging in Islamic activity. Moreover, following the forced conversion, Spain's Christian authorities implemented various measures through royal edicts which were aimed at thoroughly assimilating Moriscos. For example, the use of the Arabic language became outlawed as it was associated with Islam. And eventually, the Inquisition even launched itself into a campaign against eradicating all forms of the Arabic language. From the perspective of inquisitors, Arabic was identified with the practice of Islam in a way that knew no exceptions. As a result, possessing texts that contained Arabic characters or even speaking the language constituted a heresy, which of course was a serious criminal offense. And one can imagine what this might have meant for the Islamic practice and the knowledge of the Moriscos, and their ability to preserve their religious traditions over time. Especially considering that with regards to Arabic and the Islamic scholarly tradition, the primary language in which religious works were written was Arabic. So it's not surprising that in the works of Morisco writers, we encounter this idea often that Spanish crypto-Islam experienced a decline due to harsh religious persecution coupled with a weakening grasp of Arabic. For example, in 1602, an Aragonese Morisco by the name of Abdul Karim wrote a religious work for the education of his fellow Moriscos, which he titled The Guide to Salvation. He mentions that what motivated him to produce the work was the fact that his fellow crypto-Muslims had become ignorant of their teachings, of the teachings of their religion, and neglected its practice. Here are some excerpts from his work that I'll share with you, part of which you can see on the screen. God, having been pleased to permit that the Moors of this country should be afflicted and oppressed with so many persecutions, allowed in his infinite wisdom that the affairs of our religion should be brought to such extremity that it is not practiced either in public or in private. Prayer is laid aside and forgotten, and the few who still perform it do it secretly, and consequently with fear. And he goes on to explain why this is the case. All this owing, first of all, to the circumstances which have placed the Moors, meaning Muslims, for so many years far from any spiritual advice, and secondly, to the tyranny of the Christians, who have caused them to be all forcibly baptized through fear and terror. Now, I ask you, what knowledge can we have of religion and its dogmas? How can we serve God if we are continually disturbed and perplexed? In this account, the tyranny of the Christians, a reference to inquisitorial religious persecution, stands out as an important factor in the decline of Morisco Islam. And this is just one among other pieces of historical evidence that portray a deteriorated image of Spanish crypto-Islam. However, it should be noted that even if we do come across historical evidence of the like, it can't be used to conclude that all serious crypto-Islamic activity ceased to exist within Morisco communities. Clearly it did not, which leads to the question of how these communities were able to preserve their religious traditions in whatever capacity this was. Right, so in answering this question, historical evidence suggests that the crypto-Islamic education of Moriscos and the preservation of Islamic traditions among them was significantly aided by the efforts of a group known as the Alfaquies, and a term derived from an Arabic term meaning jurist or Islamic legal scholar. The activities of this group of Moriscos is documented in inquisitorial records as well as Morisco writings. These were individuals like Abdul Karim, the author we just mentioned of that religious work, who were responsible for the spiritual shepherding of Spain's crypto-Muslims and for addressing the challenges they faced as a religious community. However, as historian Mercedes Garcia Reno notes, they weren't Islamic scholars in the classical sense of the term. The extensive formal training required to be considered a scholar in the classical sense was difficult to attain in this period, understandably so. Instead, these men had a foundational knowledge of Arabic literacy, which allowed them to access works of a theological nature and convey their contents to other Moriscos, who were to a large extent illiterate. There's mention of the Alfaquies in inquisitorial records. For example, we learn of the case of one Gaspar Rahich, a Morisco who in 1608 was convicted by the Inquisition as an Alfaqui for teaching the Quran, the Islamic holy book, to his fellow Moriscos, among other things. The account reads, he usually carried with him the book of the Quran to read out the sect of Muhammad, and he had in his home a mosque for the teaching of it, where many Morisco men and women would go to learn. And 12 Alfaqis came together and agreed they lacked a particular book, which is a large book containing in detail all of the sect of Muhammad, and it could not be found in these kingdoms but in Algeria, and they decided to send one of the older Alfaqis for it. Interestingly, Gaspar's house is described as a mosque, highlighting its role as a gathering place where Morisco men and women could convene for instruction in Islamic teachings and to engage in other crypto-Islamic activities. Also, this account is just one among many others that illustrates the important role of the Alfaqis as religious educators. Lastly, in addressing the topic of the preservation of Islam amongst Moriscos, the role of the home as a medium for the transmission and perpetuation of Islamic ideals can't be overlooked, especially as it relates to the activities of Morisco parents. And Morisco mothers appear to have been especially important in this regard. As one might guess, the home or the domestic sphere was a space in which Morisco parents could impart religious teachings and traditions to their children in a private space that was safe from the probing eyes of inquisitorial authorities. For example, there's the case of one Morisco by the name of Don Cosme, who was arrested by the Inquisition in 1568. Under interrogation by inquisitorial authorities, he revealed that despite outer appearances, he had never been a true Christian at heart. Rather, his mother had brought him up to believe that Christ and Muhammad were both prophets and had taught him the salah, the ritual prayer said 5 times a day, as well as to observe the fast of Ramadan. As this indicates, Morisco women or mothers were particularly important transmitters of Islamic knowledge in the Morisco home, especially due to their heavy involvement in domestic roles and activities. And in fact, drawing on inquisitorial records, historian Mary Elizabeth Perry remarks that the great majority of those cases in which accused Moriscos identified the person from whom they had learned Islam, named their mothers, grandmothers, or mothers-in-law. And in the same vein, a report from the Spanish crown in Madrid underscored this trend amongst Moriscos, and it identified them as particularly steadfast and obstinate in their refusal to relinquish their heretical Islamic practices, especially by preserving Islamic rituals within the home, and importantly, in preventing them, their children, from attending mandatory Christian schools. Ultimately, the importance of the domestic sphere as a space which allowed for the perpetuation of Islamic traditions should not be overlooked. So in conclusion, an examination of the historical record makes it clear that despite any deterioration or decline experienced during the Morisco period, Islam and the enduring spirit of devotion to its ideals never ceased to exist in Spain. The Islamic spirit had survived and was very much alive. So much so that even 70 years after the forced conversions, one lady, Constanca Lopez, from an inquisitorial report, who was a Morisca, would boldly declare in public, in the presence of Christians, "We were Moors, and Moors we shall remain." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zayd. I'm marveling at how effectively you were able to summarize very succinctly such a wide-ranging research project. That was a wonderful way to start our day of learning together. So it's my pleasure next, and its relationship to identity and also language as a contested site of power when there are multiple identities or cultures or political ramifications tied to language. So it's very clear in Michael's project, right? I noticed in Daniel's presentation we've got the Hebrew iconography, and you mentioned Judeo-Portuguese. So, and then Zayd, you mentioned Arabic, and Arabic being banned, and its use being banned. And I was wondering, my question is for you, Zayd, if you could comment a little bit on the strategies that some of the Alfaquies, but others, Moriscos, Muslims at different points in late medieval Iberia used to try to get around these prohibitions of using Arabic, how they then preserved knowledge of the language or maybe used other alphabets or other ways of transmitting knowledge in their efforts to hold on to Islam in spite of the forced conversion.
Right, so one of the themes that you come across a lot when reading inquisitorial material is that the Moriscos would hide, they were very good at hiding their Arabic books, and books were constantly discovered in odd places within their homes, like under a cupboard or behind the door or something of this nature. So they were adept at keeping these books and hiding them, and of course many of them were discovered, as we know, from the inquisitorial record. And also, I think in answering your question, it's important to mention the script of Al-Hamiyado that the Moriscos invented. So most of the religious works that circulated amongst the Moriscos, it was actually written in a script known as Al-Hamiyado, which is Castilian Spanish written in Arabic script. So the Moriscos, they used this script to write about religious topics, and in most of the works that circulated amongst them that had to do with, that were theological in nature, were written in the script. And the Alfaquies, they often taught these manuscripts written in this, they taught texts written in this language to Moriscos in the script. And that's probably a testament to the fact that the Arabic language had declined to some extent, because they would be persecuted the same for writing in Arabic and Al-Arabiado, because they were both Arabic characters, so they'd be persecuted the same. So why not just write it in Arabic? Well, then the conclusion that you come to is because they had lost their knowledge of it.
Thank you so much.
To the extent that you're able to ascertain it from the sources that you are looking at, to what extent do subjects see a Christian and a true kind of Christian and Muslim identity as mutually exclusive? Like you're outwardly Christian, but you're actually a Muslim? Or to what extent do some people actually see themselves as potentially both Christian and Muslim? That because there is this kind of like progression in the idea of sort of like that Islam is like a kind of culmination of like prophets that came before, to what extent do you see subjects who may have actually seen themselves personally as kind of like both Christian and Muslim? And I sort of will give the backstory that I'm partially interested in this because I'm a South Asianist, and in the South Asian context, we see a lot of examples in which, particularly before the 19th century, the kind of like boundaries between different, like what we think of now as like different like religions are a lot more fluid, and the idea that you're kind of exclusively belong to one religion isn't necessarily always like you can't necessarily project that backwards.
So do you mean in terms of how these Moriscos viewed this themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously my subject, or the Moriscos were diverse in terms of the level to which they were committed to Islamic practice. There were some who were straight up Christians that completely assimilated. There were some who kind of existed in this middle ground between, the kind of nominal or cultural, they had some nominal or cultural affiliation with Islam, but weren't committed to it in a very serious way. But obviously, my topic of interest was these Moriscos who were committed to the preservation of Islam and to maintain its traditions throughout the 16th century. So in their writings and in their sources, I would say there isn't like a blurring of lines between the categories of Christian and Muslim. It's very clear from their writings that obviously, and there's often reference to the Christians as the authorities, of course, as tyrannical and oppressive people. So these people regarded themselves as Muslims, and it's a very distinct group from the Christian authorities that oppressed them. But of course, this wasn't the case in the cases of all the Moriscos, who were a diverse group. But in the Moriscos I was interested in, this was the overwhelming theme within the sources.
But it's particularly interesting to see the way each of them handles, in a different fashion, the question of harmony versus conflict. I think Daniel in particular, you stressed harmony in the end of your remarks.
Yes.
Rather than conflict. If you think of iconoclasts will erase actively and zealously, so there's a potential. I was wondering about the conflict in those pages. I think Julie's question to Zayd prodded in the direction of potentially a more harmonious way of thinking about that relationship. And Michael, of course, yours is a history of political conflict over language, but I think in some of your answers, you suggest that this is, in a sense, it's not intrinsic, and that in fact the question of what simplification or complex meant could be interpreted in many different ways. So I wonder if one could almost wonder about rewriting the papers and whether it would be interesting for you to emphasize the opposite of what you emphasized in your presentation. But I think the discussion has brought out the possibility for that. Incredibly rich.
Congratulations, Hisham. So